When I opened my curtains that morning, something felt wrong. At first I couldn't explain it. The sunlight looked different. Too bright. Too direct. For years, the early morning light had always filtered through the giant branches of the oak tree in my front yard. But today the light poured straight through my window like nothing stood outside anymore. My stomach tightened. I walked quickly to the front door and opened it. And then I froze. The tree was gone. Not damaged. Not trimmed. Completely gone. In its place was a wide, pale stump surrounded by sawdust and tire marks carved deep into my lawn. For a moment I couldn't move. That oak tree had been the centerpiece of my property for longer than anyone in the neighborhood could remember. 200 years old. Older than every house on the street. Older than the HOA that loved sending warning letters about mailbox colors and grass height. I stepped down from the porch slowly, staring at the stump like maybe I was still half asleep. But the smell of fresh wood in the air told me the truth. Someone had cut it down. Recently. Very recently. I walked closer and ran my hand across the smooth surface where the chainsaw had sliced through the trunk. The rings stretched across the wood like a timeline of history. Storm after storm. Winter after winter. 2 centuries of growth erased in a few hours. Unbelievable, I muttered. Across the street, my neighbor Linda was standing near her mailbox watching me. The moment she saw me notice her, she walked over. "Hey, you just got back?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," I said. "What happened to my tree?" Linda looked uncomfortable. "Well, the HOA had a landscaping crew here yesterday afternoon." My chest tightened. The HOA. They said the tree was a safety hazard. I looked back at the stump. That tree survived hurricanes. "I told them that," Linda said. "And they said the board already approved the removal." I laughed once. Short. Sharp. Because that made absolutely no sense. "Did they leave any notice?" I asked. Linda pointed toward my porch. "They taped something to your door." I walked back and pulled the folded paper free. At the top were bold words. HOA Property Compliance Order. I skimmed the page quickly. Unauthorized landscaping risk. Board approved removal. Contractor completed service. Then I saw the line that made my jaw tighten. Homeowner responsible for removal cost, $4,800. I read it again just to be sure. They didn't just cut down my tree. They expected me to pay for it. I looked back toward the empty space in my yard. Then I shook my head slowly. Because what the HOA didn't know was that tree wasn't just old. It was legally protected. And cutting it down was about to cost them far more than $4,800. I stood in my yard staring at the stump for a long time. The more I looked at it, the more the anger started replacing the shock. That tree wasn't just decoration. It had been there long before this neighborhood existed. Before the roads. Before the HOA rules. Before most of the houses on this street were even built. Linda was still standing nearby. "You okay?" she asked carefully. "No," I said honestly. "I'm really not." She glanced at the stump again. "The crew was here most of the afternoon," she said. "Big truck. Chainsaws. The whole thing. Did anyone stop them?" "A few neighbors asked questions," she replied. "But the crew kept saying they had approval from the HOA board." I walked around the stump slowly. Fresh sawdust still covered the grass like pale snow. The trunk had been enormous. Even the remaining stump reached almost to my knee. But something caught my eye near the center of the wood. A small piece of metal. Half buried in the grain. I crouched down and brushed away the sawdust with my hand. Linda leaned closer. "What is that?" A small round marker appeared as the dust cleared. Green metal. Stamped lettering. My chest tightened instantly. Wow, Linda whispered. What does it say? I wiped the metal surface clean. The letters were still perfectly readable. Cedar County Heritage Registry. Linda blinked. Wait, what? That, I said quietly, is a county heritage marker. Her eyes widened. You mean that tree was protected? Yes. The realization hit both of us at the same time. Linda looked back toward the empty sky above the yard. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's bad. I stood up slowly. That's very bad. Because heritage markers weren't decorations. They were legal protection. Trees with those tags weren't just part of someone's yard. They were part of the county's environmental preservation program. You couldn't just cut one down. Not without permits. Not without inspections. And definitely not because an HOA board thought it looked too big. Linda crossed her arms nervously. Do you think the HOA knew about that? I looked down at the metal tag again. The marker had been embedded in the trunk for decades. It wasn't hidden. Anyone standing near the tree could see it. They should have known, I said. And if they didn't? I pulled my phone out and started taking pictures. The stump. The marker. The sawdust. The tire tracks on the lawn. Then I stood up again. Then they made the most expensive landscaping mistake of their lives. Linda tilted her head. How expensive? I looked back at the stump one more time. Because I had read the county ordinance years ago when my grandfather showed me the tree's registration papers. And the number was impossible to forget. Let's just say. The HOA is about to regret this instantly. I didn't call the HOA. Not yet. Instead, I grabbed my jacket, got into my truck, and drove straight to the Cedar Ridge HOA office at the entrance of the neighborhood. If someone was going to explain why a 200-year-old tree had just been destroyed, it was going to be the person who approved it. Richard Halbrook, HOA president. The office looked exactly the way HOA offices always do. Perfect lawn. Neatly trimmed hedges. A sign reminding residents about trash bin rules. I walked inside. A receptionist sat behind a small desk typing on her computer. She looked up politely. Good morning. Can I help you? I'm here to see Richard Halbrook. Her smile hesitated for half a second. What is this regarding? My tree. That was all I needed to say. The smile disappeared. Oh, she said quietly. Please have a seat. I didn't sit. She picked up the phone. Mr. Halbrook. A homeowner is here about the oak removal. A short pause. Then she nodded and hung up. He'll see you. His office door was already open when I reached the hallway. Richard Halbrook sat behind a large wooden desk like he owned the entire neighborhood. Late 50s. Pressed dress shirt. Expensive watch. The expression of someone very comfortable with authority. Mr. Carter, he said smoothly. I expected you might stop by. I stayed standing. You cut down my tree. He folded his hands calmly. Yes. No warning. There was a compliance notice posted yesterday morning. That notice went up after the tree was already gone. He shrugged slightly. Either way, the board approved the removal. Why? The tree violated community landscaping regulations. I stared at him. That tree has been standing longer than this HOA has existed. Yes, he said. That's exactly the problem. What problem? It was far too large for a residential property. I actually laughed. You cut down a 200-year-old oak because it was too large. Halbrook leaned back in his chair. The branches were overextending the sidewalk area. It shaded half the street, which interferes with uniform landscaping. I shook my head slowly. You really didn't check anything before ordering that removal, did you? His eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and opened the photo of the metal marker embedded in the stump. Then I placed the phone on his desk. Do you recognize that? He leaned forward to look. A metal tag, he said. Yes. Probably an old survey marker. No. I tapped the screen. That's a Cedar County Heritage Registry tag. He frowned slightly. So that tree was legally protected. Halbrook didn't react immediately. Instead he gave a small confident smile. Mr. Carter, he said calmly. The HOA has authority over landscaping. I smiled back. No, I replied. You don't. And why not? Because cutting down a protected heritage tree. I paused just long enough for him to wonder where this was going. Is a county-level violation. And the fine for that violation was going to shock him. Richard Halbrook stared at the photo on my phone for several seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair and gave a small dismissive laugh. Mr. Carter, he said calmly, I think you're exaggerating the situation. Am I? Yes. He tapped the desk lightly. The HOA handles landscaping compliance for every property in this community. That might be true for bushes, I said. But not for protected heritage trees. His smile didn't disappear. I've never heard of such a thing. That doesn't surprise me. Halbrook folded his arms. Even if that tree had some kind of marker, the HOA still had the right to remove it for safety reasons. You didn't call the county. We didn't need to. You didn't check any registry. It wasn't necessary. I shook my head slowly. You really don't understand the situation you just created. His expression hardened slightly. Then enlighten me. Cedar County has a heritage preservation ordinance. So that oak tree was registered under that ordinance. He shrugged. Even if that's true, I doubt it changes much. I smiled slightly. That's interesting. Why? Because the county doesn't see it that way. For the first time, he hesitated. What exactly are you implying? I slid my phone back into my pocket. I'm implying the county inspector will want to see the stump. Inspector? Yes. Halbrook leaned forward. You reported this already? Not yet. That answer confused him. Then how would the county even know about it? I glanced toward the office window. Because your landscaping crew used chainsaws for 3 hours. So. My neighbor across the street works for the county park department. Halbrook's smile disappeared. And he already made a call. Right on cue, Halbrook's desk phone rang. The sound cut through the room like an alarm. We both looked at it. For a moment he didn't move. Then he slowly picked it up. Richard Halbrook speaking. A pause. Yes. His posture changed immediately. County Preservation Office. Another pause. His eyes shifted toward me. Yes, we did authorize a removal yesterday. Silence filled the room while he listened. Then his face slowly lost color. I see. Another long pause. Yes, the property is on Oak Ridge Drive. More silence. Then he cleared his throat nervously. I wasn't aware the tree was registered. The voice on the other end must have said something important. Because Halbrook's shoulders dropped slightly. Yes, he said quietly. I understand. He hung up the phone slowly. The room felt completely different now. Well? I asked. Halbrook rubbed his forehead. The county inspector. Yes. Will be here tomorrow morning. I nodded once. That sounds about right. He looked at me again. What exactly does that inspection involve? I crossed my arms. Mostly measuring the stump. And calculating the penalty. He swallowed. What penalty? I smiled slightly. The one your HOA is about to regret instantly. The next morning the entire neighborhood felt unusually quiet. People were pretending to do normal things. Walking their dogs. Checking their mail. Washing their cars. But every single one of them kept glancing toward my yard. Because word had spread fast. The HOA had cut down a heritage tree. And the county was coming. At exactly 9 o'clock, a white truck with the Cedar County seal turned onto Oak Ridge Drive. It rolled slowly to the curb in front of my house. The door opened and a woman stepped out wearing a green county jacket and carrying a clipboard. "Inspector." She walked toward the stump while studying the yard carefully. "Mr. Carter," she asked when she saw me. "That's me. I'm Laura Bennett with Cedar County Heritage Preservation." She crouched beside the stump without saying another word. For almost a full minute she examined the cut surface. Then she brushed away some sawdust near the center of the wood. The metal marker appeared. The heritage tag. Her expression tightened instantly. "Well," she said quietly. "That answers my first question." "What question is that?" I asked. "Whether this tree was registered." She wrote something on her clipboard. Across the street, 3 neighbors had gathered near the sidewalk pretending to watch their dogs. Nobody was fooling anyone. A black sedan pulled up behind the county truck. Richard Halbrook stepped out. He walked toward us with forced confidence. "Inspector Bennett," he said politely. She looked up. "Yes. I'm Richard Halbrook, president of the Cedar Ridge HOA. I'm aware." He glanced at the stump. This removal was approved by the HOA board for safety reasons. Inspector Bennett didn't react. Instead she pulled a measuring tape from her bag and stretched it across the stump. She read the number and wrote it down. Then she stood up. "Diameter, 71 inches. Halbrook frowned. "Is that important?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because the penalty for removing a registered heritage oak depends partly on its size." His voice tightened slightly. "Penalty." Inspector Bennett closed her clipboard. "Mr. Halbrook, was any permit issued for this removal?" "No." "Did the HOA contact the preservation office before cutting the tree?" "No." "Did the contractor verify the heritage marker?" "I'm not sure." She nodded slowly. "That's unfortunate." Halbrook tried to keep his voice calm. "Look, if there's been some misunderstanding, we're happy to cooperate." "This is not a misunderstanding." "What is it then?" Inspector Bennett looked directly at him. "This is an unauthorized destruction of protected historical property." The neighbors across the street suddenly looked very interested in their dogs. Halbrook swallowed. "And what does that mean exactly?" Inspector Bennett didn't hesitate. "It means the HOA is responsible for a civil penalty." "How much?" She glanced once more at the massive stump. Then she answered. "The base violation for a heritage oak this size starts at $1 million. And judging by Halbrook's expression, the HOA was finally beginning to understand its mistake. The moment Inspector Bennett said $1 million, the entire street went silent. Even the neighbors pretending not to watch stopped pretending. Richard Halbrook looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under him. "$1 million, he repeated slowly. "Yes," the inspector replied calmly. "That is the base civil penalty." Halbrook forced a weak laugh. "That can't be correct." Inspector Bennett didn't react. "The county heritage ordinance is very clear." "But this was an honest mistake," he said. "That does not change the violation." Halbrook rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "Well, surely there's some flexibility in the penalty." "Possibly." He leaned forward slightly. "Good. But that depends on cooperation and investigation." Halbrook's expression tightened again. "What investigation?" Inspector Bennett flipped a page on her clipboard. We need to determine who authorized the removal. The HOA board approved it? Unanimously. Halbrook hesitated. Yes. Across the street, one of the neighbors quietly whispered something to another. Everyone had heard the word unanimously. Inspector Bennett wrote something down. Then the HOA board shares responsibility. Halbrook stared at the stump again. This is unbelievable. I folded my arms. No, I said. What? This was avoidable. He looked at me. You think I don't know that now? You could have checked the heritage registry. We didn't know about the registry. The metal tag was embedded in the trunk. Halbrook looked back at the stump. Then back at the inspector. This kind of fine would destroy the HOA. Inspector Bennett closed her clipboard. That is not the county's concern. Halbrook exhaled slowly. What happens next? The violation report will be submitted today. And then? The county will review the case. And the penalty? Most likely upheld. Halbrook pulled out his phone and stepped away from the stump. Within seconds he was speaking quickly. Yes, we have a major problem, he whispered. I didn't need to hear the rest. He was calling the HOA board. A few minutes later he returned, looking even worse. The board wants an emergency meeting tonight, he said. Inspector Bennett nodded. That's a good idea. They're concerned about the financial impact. That's understandable. He turned to me. Mr. Carter. Yes. If the HOA offered compensation. I raised an eyebrow. You mean a settlement? Yes. What kind? He hesitated. One that avoids escalating the situation. I looked back at the stump. 200 years of growth erased in a single afternoon. Then I answered calmly. You should talk to the county. That's not what I meant. I know. Halbrook sighed heavily. Mr. Carter, this could bankrupt the association. I shrugged slightly. You probably should have thought about that. Before you cut down my tree. By that evening the entire neighborhood knew about the emergency HOA meeting. Word spread quickly when something dramatic happened in a quiet suburban community. Especially when that drama involved $1 million problem. The HOA clubhouse parking lot was packed. Residents gathered in small groups outside the building, whispering to each other. Some were curious. Some were nervous. Others were simply angry. Because if the HOA had to pay a massive fine, it could affect everyone living in the neighborhood. I walked into the meeting room just as the board members took their seats at the front table. Richard Halbrook looked exhausted. The confidence he had shown the day before was completely gone. We'll begin immediately, he announced. The room quieted. As many of you know, the HOA authorized the removal of the oak tree on Oak Ridge Drive yesterday. Several people in the audience nodded. Halbrook continued carefully. Unfortunately, we have since learned that the tree was listed in the Cedar County Heritage Registry. Murmurs filled the room. What does that mean? Someone asked from the back. Halbrook cleared his throat. It means the removal may have violated county preservation laws. A man near the front spoke up. How serious is the violation? Halbrook hesitated. Then he answered. The base civil penalty is estimated at $1 million. The room exploded with shocked voices. That's insane. How could this happen? Didn't anyone check the registry? Halbrook raised his hands to calm the crowd. The board relied on the landscaping contractor's assessment. A woman in the front row shook her head. So you didn't check anything yourselves? Silence followed. That silence answered the question. Another resident stood up. What happens if the HOA has to pay that fine? Halbrook sighed. The association does not currently have funds to cover a penalty of that size. So what does that mean for us? Someone asked. It could require a special assessment on homeowners. The murmuring grew louder. People were suddenly very concerned. One man near the door spoke sharply. "Wait a minute, why should we pay for a mistake the board made?" More voices joined in agreement. Halbrook looked overwhelmed. "The board is exploring options to resolve the situation." "What options?" "Negotiation with the homeowner." Several people turned to look at me. Halbrook followed their gaze. "Mr. Carter is here tonight." All eyes shifted in my direction. One of the residents asked the obvious question. "What does he want?" I stood up slowly. The room went quiet again. "What I want," I said calmly, "is accountability." Halbrook rubbed his forehead. "And if we offer compensation?" I looked around the room. Neighbors who had watched that tree grow for decades. Families who used to sit in its shade. Then I answered. "You can start by letting the county finish its investigation." The room stayed silent. Because everyone understood something important now. The HOA hadn't just removed a tree. They had created a very expensive problem. And the consequences. The next afternoon my phone rang while I was standing in the yard. I was still looking at the stump. It had only been 2 days, but the empty space already felt strange. For 200 years that tree had shaded half the street. Now the sun poured straight across the lawn. My phone buzzed again. "Unknown number." I answered. "Hello. Mr. Carter," a man said. "Yes. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm legal counsel for the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association." Of course he was. "I assume you're calling about the tree," I said. "Yes." There was a brief pause. "The HOA board would like to discuss a possible resolution." That was fast. "Well," he replied carefully, "the county's preliminary report was delivered this morning. And the potential financial exposure is significant. $1 million. Yes. And possibly more," he admitted. I looked down at the stump again. 2 centuries of growth reduced to a flat circle of wood. "So what kind of resolution are you proposing?" I asked. "The board is prepared to offer compensation." "How much?" Another pause. $500,000. I almost laughed. "Half the penalty. We're trying to avoid bankruptcy for the association." "That sounds like an HOA problem." "Mr. Carter, the board believes a private settlement would benefit everyone involved. Everyone except the person whose tree you destroyed." He cleared his throat. "We understand your frustration. You cut down a protected heritage tree." "Yes. And then tried to charge me for it?" "That invoice has already been withdrawn." "That's generous." He sighed. "Look, we're trying to resolve this responsibly." Responsibly would have been checking the registry before cutting the tree down. Silence followed. Then he asked the question the board clearly wanted answered. "What would you consider fair compensation?" I walked slowly around the stump again. The rings stretched across the wood like a timeline. Each one representing another year the tree had survived. Storms. Droughts. Generations. All gone now. "You want my honest answer?" I asked. "Yes. Let the county handle it." "That could destroy the HOA." "That wasn't my decision." Another long pause followed. Finally Reeves spoke again. "If the county enforces the full penalty, homeowners here may face major assessments." I looked across the street. Several neighbors were standing outside watching quietly. They knew what was happening. And they knew why. "That's unfortunate," I said. "You're not willing to negotiate?" "No." "Why not?" "Because the HOA already made its decision." "What decision?" "To cut down my tree." I ended the call. Then I looked back at the empty sky above my yard. Because there was one thing the HOA still didn't fully understand. The county investigation had only just begun. 3 days later, the county's final decision arrived. It came in a thick envelope with the Cedar County seal stamped across the front. The kind of letter that immediately makes people nervous. I opened it at the kitchen table. The first page was the official inspection report. Inspector Laura Bennett had documented everything. The measurements of the stump. The location of the heritage marker. The contractor records from the HOA landscaping crew. Even photographs taken the morning after the removal. There was no confusion left. The oak tree that once stood in my yard had been officially registered in the Cedar County Heritage Preservation Registry since 1989. Which meant its removal required a county permit. And no permit had ever been requested. The report concluded with a single sentence that said everything. Unauthorized destruction of protected heritage oak confirmed. I flipped to the second page. That's where the penalty was listed. Bold letters. Clear numbers. Civil violation penalty, $1 million. I leaned back in my chair. The HOA had officially crossed the line. Later that afternoon, Richard Halbrook and two other board members walked up my driveway. They looked exhausted. Halbrook held a folder in his hands. "We received the county decision this morning," he said quietly. "I assumed you had," I replied. He nodded. "The full penalty has been issued. $1 million. Yes." He glanced toward the stump in my yard. "That tree stood longer than this entire neighborhood. 200 years. He nodded again. "We should have checked before approving the removal." "Yes," I said. "You should have." The other board member stepped forward. "We're filing an insurance claim through the association." "That's your choice." Halbrook sighed. "This will take years for the HOA to recover from." I looked past them at the empty space in my yard. Sunlight now hit the ground where the branches once spread wide. Children used to sit under that shade during summer afternoons. Neighbors used to gather there during block parties. Now it was just open sky. Halbrook spoke again. "The board understands now how serious this mistake was. I'm glad." He looked at the stump one more time. "I never imagined a landscaping decision could cost this much." "That's because it wasn't landscaping." "What was it?" "History." Silence settled over the yard. Finally Halbrook said the only honest thing he had said since this started. "The HOA regrets this instantly." I nodded slowly. "Next time, leave my property alone."
Because the HOA learned something that week every homeowner in the neighborhood wouldn't remember. So some rules belong to HOAs, but some things are far older than their authority, and restoring them can cost $1 million.